lot of important materials here for us to look at. And so we'll just kind of gauge it week by week in terms of how fast, or do we just continue to go at this pace? So anyway, before we begin, I've asked Brother Elsie if he would lead us in our opening prayer. Thank you, Elsie. So 2 weeks ago, we left off in 1 Timothy chapter 2. We were just finishing up verse 8. In this section here, it's talking about roles of men and women in the worship. And so let me just mention just briefly here in verse 8 before we end up going here into verse 9. And so what my plans are is to finish up this chapter. I'd also mention to you that there was a lengthy article in one of the Abilene newspapers that were talking about some changes that are going on out there in Abilene among some of the churches and the role that women play during the worship services. And I do think it's important enough that I do want to devote a little time. I said maybe I just read a few sentences, but the more and more I looked at it, I just don't think that just kind of giving a brief summary is going to do that justice. I want to go ahead and read that article to you, and it just kind of shows you some of the contemporary issues that the church is facing. I'm sure there's been issues before, along these lines, but it seems like that's mostly been within the denominational world. But increasingly, even within the Lord's church, we're seeing some things that are just blatantly unscriptural. And as we're about ready to look at the role of women, I mean, it's pretty clear cut in terms of what Paul is telling Timothy to instruct the church at Ephesus. And so we're going to devote some time to reading that article. And if you do have any comments, please certainly want to make sure you have the opportunity to do that. But real briefly, before we enter into verse 9, I do want to mention verse 8 here and just go back just as a review here. And he says here, I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. We had talked 2 weeks ago about this idea of lifting of hands, and really, it's believed that this is really more of a metaphor. You can't literally have holy hands. So really, it's more along the lines of the attitude, the gesture of submission to God. Now, if we find someone that's raising their hands as they're praying, is that going to be something someone's going to lose their soul? No. But certainly, we need to consider those things because, you see those kind of things that are done in the denominational world, particularly the lifting of hands within the Pentecostal church. And, what kind of influences is that going to have on other people? It's just like with Paul speaking about, I eat meat, I won't eat meat, but whatever it is, I want to make sure that I do to bring someone to Christ, and I don't want to become a stumbling block to him. So and also it can be a distraction. But again, it's not something that I would say you're going to lose your soul over. But the last part of this verse, it says here, without wrath and doubting. And I know there's some question in terms of exactly what he's talking about there. And as I started to look at different people and what they were saying about it, it was kind of all over the place. But I would think probably within the context of the passage, I just think that he's saying here that, you don't want to use prayer as maybe a form of revenge. You think about someone that may say, God, we pray for our brother who's a scoundrel, who's an adulterer, and, all this other stuff, And at least there were some commentators that were saying that maybe had been what was going on in Ephesus, that prayer was actually being used as a form of revenge. And that's why here he's saying here, when you do pray to God, that you need to do that with wrath and then also without doubting. We also need to have faith that whatever we do ask God, then according to His will, that it will be answered. So, but it is interesting with all the issues that's going on in Ephesus that Paul is having to instruct Timothy. These are the kind of things that you need to discuss with the church at Ephesus. So we now move on here to verse 9. And as I mentioned here, within our culture, I've had a few encounters with women I've talked to at work where we've had brief discussions on the subject of women and worship services, and they tended to disagree with me, and I'd show them, what passages I was justifying it, and they said, well, that was 2,000 years ago. That's not today. So you see issues today that, sadly, our culture seems to be pitting men against women and vice versa. And the fact that, women should have every bit as a right to men to do whatever within the church setting. And as I'd mentioned as we were closing 2 weeks ago, what we're about ready to look at, I don't think in any way does that indicate that women are any less capable of leading a prayer or teaching. It's just simply a matter there is an order that God has put in place, and as Paul's about ready to speak about, and that's something we have to respect. We're in worship to worship God, and therefore He has that right to be able to dictate how He's going to be worshiped and how the conduct of that worship is going to be. And so here in verse 9, he's going to pick up here and he's going to talk about women in the worship. And he says, in like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothes. Verse 10, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. So verse 10 kind of clarifies verse 9 there. So the orderly community requires women also to act with decorum during the assembly, dress appropriately, modest dress. He mentions here about braided hair and gold and pearls and costly clothes. There are some ancient sources, and mind you that, in Ephesus here, you also have this pagan temple of Diana, Artemis. I think those are interchangeable names of this temple, and it was a significant temple. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so you can imagine the paganism that's coming in this city and all the people that believe in these pagan ideas. And then on top of that, you have the synagogues there with the Jews, and then you have the Christians here. And the influences from this culture within the church, and we can see here that it does appear to be that they are being influenced by the culture. So, but as I said, we do have some ancient sources here that does mention that these kind of dress, these accoutrements, were associated with sexual promiscuity and rebellion against common standards of decency. So it may very well be that this kind of dress is really known to be associated with prostitutes. Now, in and of itself, braided hair, golden pearls, and costly clothes, I don't think in and of itself it's sinful, but it's what kind of attitude are you having? He mentions here about good works. That should be the focus, not garnering attention from your appearance. But he does remind them that for the women, they need to dress modestly. And again, he emphasizes there with good works. That needs to be your emphasis there on godliness. So the responsibility of women in church meetings needed more explanation by Paul as he would instruct Timothy. So Paul's point in these verses was that good works that express a godly character should characterize Christian women over the way that they dress in grooming themselves. The contrast is between works and wardrobe. Obviously, Paul was not saying that external appearance, including good grooming and cleanliness, is not important, but he just says the emphasis there in this time of worship needs to be focused on godliness and on good works. However, a Christian woman should be set apart or attention given for her Christ-like behavior more than for her clothes, hairstyle, and other external elements that are of primary importance to unbelievers. And that's why we contrast that, maybe in the pagan world, that was what the emphasis was on your appearance. And he's saying we should not be like the world. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 says, "Do not let your adornment be merely outward. Let your adornment be inward because of your faith." So this term modest translates as a combination of modesty and humility. And moderation or being discreet means with soundness of mind, self-control, attitude, and attention. So it all comes down to a matter, it's not the outward appearance that's important, but it's the inward attitude that the women should have. So he moves down here then to verse 11, and he says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission." So just as the church is to live in a quiet spirit, and we're reminded of that back in verse 2 of this chapter, the women are instructed to learn in silence with all submission. The term used in verse 2 as well as here in verse 11 are one in the same term, and the phrase "have authority" explains its context. As I mentioned, heretics had been taking advantage of women in Ephesus. And, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 15, as we'll see later in the book, it mentions there some of the young widows had already gone after Satan. And also in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, that we had mentioned here, also it says there, "Make captives of gullible women." So at least there were some women here at Ephesus. And I don't know if these would be recent converts or maybe what influences they had had from the culture around them. But there were some women that were gullible, and they were believing the influences from these other outside pressures that the church finds. And so, as I said, so he mentions this later on in 1 Timothy. And in part, I'm thinking this is going to be part of the explanation why Paul really needs to speak about this to the church at Ephesus, why he tells Timothy this is something that you need to speak about. Paul was concerned with limiting the teaching to those needing to teach. And as we end this chapter, the next chapter has to do with elders and deacons. And I think ultimately what Paul's concern is here, that there is such an issue with the church there at Ephesus that really you need to have elders that are there teaching. You need to have the men that are most respected, the men that are mature Christians that are doing the teaching. But it sounds like here, at least in Ephesus, that they just don't really have control in terms of who's up there, who's teaching, and what influences that they are making to the church, or to the members of the church. But as we will see in the next chapter, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, one of the requirements for elders is able to teach. And in chapter 5, verse 17, labor in word and doctrine. So I think this is where Paul, in his thought here, as he's speaking about women and the need for Ephesus, we're going to find in chapter 3, that's when he's going to bring up about the elders and deacons. And I think ultimately that's the point he's going to make here, is that who needs to be doing the teaching in Ephesus. So due to concerns of false teachers, Paul was determined to ensure that the church is nurtured by those who are recognized teachers. And as I said, within the context of this book, in chapters 2 and chapters 3, I'm thinking what Paul is thinking here is older men, because of their knowledge, their age, their experience, and they're also recognized as teachers. So in context of those ancient church homes, and as I'd mentioned earlier that, most of the congregations, if not all that they met, particularly the early church, they met in people's homes. They did not meet in some building. But in context of the ancient church homes, these men, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, this next chapter on elders, one of the requirements are elders that they rule their home. They were supposed to be like respected patriarchs of an extended family who teach, who guide, who correct those who are under their authority. So as I said, I think where he's going with this, not just limiting in terms of women not teaching the congregation, but also that for the need specifically for Ephesus, that this is going to need to be elders. These are going to need to be the cream of the crop of the men who are older, mature men who've been in the faith for a long time and who are faithful. So in 1 Timothy, the primary task of the truth is to give authoritative instruction to the church in matters concerning doctrine and conduct. So a noteworthy feature of these epistles is that of teaching and instructing moral conduct. And so much of here we're referring to future chapters here in the book, but in 1 Timothy chapter 6, it talks there about honoring masters, error, and greed. And then in Titus chapter 2, verse 1 through 15, there's qualities of sound church doctrine. So again, we mentioned the first week we were here that, that's the themes of keeping the faith and of sound doctrine. And so at least here with the women here at Ephesus that were at least up teaching, that needed to be changed. It needed to be corrected because apparently at least the teaching that was going on there in Paul's eyes, it was unscriptural from the content maybe of what they were teaching, but also just the fact that the role that the women were playing there at that church. So Paul indicates that the future of the church rests on having godly teachers. So he mentions here in verse 12, and he is now going to speak here, why is it that, that women should not be teaching in the service? He's going to give some context to this. He states women should not be teaching, but now he says in verse 12, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. So regarding their participation in the meetings of the church, Paul taught that women were to let the men provide the public instruction and leadership. He did not mean that women should surrender their minds or their conscience to men, but that they should voluntarily take the position of learners in church meetings. Women should not accept the role of teacher of the whole congregation or as a leader of a whole church. This term, or this verb here, teach and exercise authority, are in the present tense in the Greek text, which means it's of a continual type ministry. This is not a one-time thing. This is an ongoing thing that you have a woman that is usurping a man's authority, but she's up there teaching. And Paul is saying, no, that's not going to be acceptable. I know that probably a big issue back in verse 11, that term of submissiveness. Concerning that term, and we have a similar scripture in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 and 22, where Paul says, submitting one another in the fear of God, and that wives submit to your husbands. And there's also another verse in Colossians chapter 3, verse 18 that says, wives submit to your husbands. So there's an order that's in place here that God has established with a family, and the same order also we're going to find is also during the worship services. So this the Greek word here means to rank of order. You think of military life. You have a captain, you have a sergeant. They both play very important roles. And not that any of their roles are any less important, but, one of the things that we rely on with the church is order. We can come here, and because of our heritage, because we have the Word, because we're obedient to the Word, and we have this order, this is a place we can come that we're comforted. We know there's no chaos here. So just like in the military, you have a captain, you have a sergeant. Well, there's got to be some kind of order. There has to be some kind of line of authority so we don't have that chaos. And so for God, as He implements this, as He goes in place and He has a certain order, this order's in place because there's not chaos. There's not chaos within the family. There's not chaos within the church. So it's something that's essential. So rank has to do with order and authority, not personal superiority or inferiority. And I think, sadly, that's where the culture, we find a lot of issues where certainly people looking at the conservative Church of Christ say, how dare you? Women should have every bit as a right to be able to get up and do the same kind of functions as men. But of course, that's against God's word. So another illustration of a willing submission is Jesus. Although superior to all other human beings, nonetheless, He submitted to human beings. In Luke chapter 2, verse 51, we have He submitted to His parents as a child. And in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 through 11, He was obedient to the point of death. So even Christ, even within there, Christ practiced obedience, just like we are to practice obedience too, to this order that's in place. God will reward His submission to the Father, and He will reward women who submit to his will as unto the Lord. First Peter chapter 5, verse 6 and 7 says there, humble yourselves to the mighty hand of God. So both for men and women, we have to be humble to God. We have to be respectful for the Word of God. Order needs to be established in Ephesus, and it's not in place right now. So it's a big concern here to Paul and why he's touching on this. So exactly what did Paul prohibit women from doing in verse 12? So he did not want them to teach a man or to exercise authority over a man. So it's limited. But these are the things that Paul is saying women should not be doing in the local church meetings. We'll find in the next chapter in verse 3, verse 15, Paul reminds Timothy here, he says, I write you so that you may conduct yourselves in the house of God. And so these things that he's writing here are very much applicable to the house of God. This is the way that we need to behave. So this is more appropriate to the male's function in the church to take on the leadership roles as an intermediary between God and the people. And as he's going to start speaking here, he's going to go back to Genesis and the time of creation. So there, in context of what he's saying, this is not just limited to the church at Ephesus, but this is the order that God has put in place for the church. There are certain roles the men have in terms of those leadership roles and in teaching of the congregation as a whole and in the preaching of the congregation as a whole. Because this involves interpreting God's words to the church as an authoritative figure. So there's authoritative roles that are being played here for the teacher and for the preacher, and certainly also in aspects of the eldership. So Paul was forbidding women in this passage from regularly teaching men in local church corporate worship in the whole worship service. Paul approved of women teaching women and children. You know, in Titus chapter 2, verse 3 through 5, it says there are older women teaching younger women. So we see the function there that women do have a role of teaching the younger women. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says there, Timothy dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and mother Eunice. So the influence on these two individuals in Timothy's life and how they were teaching him as a family member is this very young child. So there's roles there for women within the household to be able to teach their children. And also instructing men privately. There's no condemnation for that. You know, we have a passage here in Acts chapter 18, verse 26, where Aquila and Priscilla were teaching Apollos. He was already mighty in the scriptures, but it says there that these two women were teaching him more accurately. So we also have the role for women there to teaching men one-on-one. But the limitations here that he puts is in the corporate worship. That's not going to be the role for women. So the Greek word here translated exercise authority and have authority, or maybe some translations say usurp authority, means to act on one's own authority or to act in an autocratic manner. And as I said, that creates chaos. And that's what's happening with the church at Ephesus. There's chaos. There has to be an order within the church. So how about 1 Corinthians 14:34? Paul told the women there to keep silent in the church, and they were not permitted to speak. Now, given the context of the passage, this may have been a specific issue within the Corinthian church. He used a different Greek word here than what was used here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and it's translated as quiet. So this term maybe does not necessarily mean absolute silence, but it literally means settle down or not unruly. So Paul wanted the women to express appropriate deference to the teacher or to the leader by gaining knowledge from instruction. So perhaps Paul imposed a stricter standard, maybe even on the Corinthian church that was normal, but that may, as I said, may be specifically concerning some issue at Corinth. I did not devote more time to trying to look what that was up, other than I know that the two Greek terms there are different. And his instructions here in 1 Timothy reflect really a more of a normal situation. This is just a common thing here that he's speaking about in 1 Timothy. In the case of the Corinthian church, Paul maybe meant that women should not take part in the judging of prophets. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 29 in the context of the passage. So that may have been unique there to what was going on, but still, this instruction he's given Timothy for the church at Ephesus still would be applicable there also to the church of Corinth. But as I said in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 19, about judging prophets, which was maybe an exercise of formal position within the church and their authority. But the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34 there seems to favor this view. So despite the fact that it's somewhat different, what he's saying here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it's still going to be applicable there also in the church at Corinth. But now he gives some clarification here on this. So he's given this reasoning that he did not want women to exercise authority over men in this church setting. But he now gives more clarification on that. And as I mentioned, he goes back here to the creation. And he says here in verse 13 and 14, "For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived by the woman, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression." So he goes back there to the creation. And we have that order of the creation, the man, and then the woman was created out of the rib of man. So Paul gave 2 reasons why women should not conduct themselves in the church meeting as he just specified. So first, for the creation onward, it was God's intention that the male should lead the female. And Paul reminded his readers that God made Adam first, and then secondly, made a suitable companion for him in Eve. We find that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 through 25. But God made Eve for Adam. He did not make Adam for Eve. This, however, implies no essential superiority to men over women. God created Adam and Eve equal in the sense that they needed and complemented one another. However, God entrusted Adam with leadership responsibilities over his wife. And that's why I say I think sometimes our culture, they want to pit men and women against one another, and it should not be the case. Men and women have unique capabilities, but it does not mean any one of them is better or worse than the other. Matthew Henry, an English theologian that lived in the latter half of the 1600s and the early part of the 1700s, I like his comment he makes about the creation of woman. And he writes here, "Women were created from the rib of man to be beside him, not from his head and not from his top, nor from his feet to be trampled by him, but from under his arm to be protected by him, near his heart to be loved by him." I like the symbolism there. It wasn't from the head, it wasn't from the feet, it was from the rib. So even though we have this order of the man within the household and also within the church, they're really co-equals. They complement one another in terms of their unique talents. But as I said, sadly, I think our culture, just does a disservice, particularly for women, in trying to maybe confuse the roles that they should have, certainly within the worship service. So here, secondly, in verse 14, as part of the judgment on Eve at the fall, God confirmed and he made permanent the leadership of the role that men would have over women. In Genesis 3:16, he says, "He shall rule over you." So it was a result of her deception by the serpent that Eve fell. The woman being deceived fell into deception. Please note, I do not believe that God confirmed Eve and all women as followers because they were susceptible to deception over men. It was just in that one situation that she was deceived. And therefore, because of that, God has implemented the order here within the family. So, adequate evidence to support such a sweeping generalization is really lacking here. So, as I said, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Timothy's genuine faith from his grandmother Eunice. In Titus chapter 2, verse 4, older women admonish the younger women. There's roles that they play. There's just certain roles that they can't play. But I think also that also goes to the fact there's some unique talents that women have. Rather, it was evidently because Eve, on that one occasion, was deceived, that God confirmed her and her daughters in their position and followers. Some writers believe that Paul argued only from the creation and that he used the fall simply to illustrate his argument, but it has seemed, at least by most scholars, that he used two separate arguments. In the Ephesian church, some of the women had been led astray by false teachers, as we mentioned, it'd be in chapter 5, verse 15, but also who were themselves misled by Satan. So this is one of the reasons Paul referred to the fall here, was that some women in the Ephesian church were in danger of doing what Eve did, namely being deceived by false teachers. He cited God's intention for male-female relationships, specifically in a marriage context, not in general social situations, and that Christian men and women should bring their proper relationship to one another in marriage over and into the church and apply it to the household of God as well as to the household of the church family. So verse 15, and I think this is the last verse here. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness, and with self-control. So verse 15, the phrase here, women are saved through childbearing. In these epistles, it is a reminder of the dignity and value of the home. These women would be forfeiting their role at home and bring shame on the church. I mean, they already have a very important role within the home, as well as the roles that we've spoken here also. But by them also taking on the leadership roles, then what's the likelihood that that role at home is going to be abused? So the choice was exchanging their Christian role for the values of culture. As I said, that's, I think, what's going on here, these influences within the culture at Ephesus. That being of selfish ideas rather than to declare and demonstrate the reconciling power of Christ. Christ died for all, and that needs to be demonstrated by our lives together as a church and also in the home. So perhaps the best explanation of this difficult verse is this, that God promised women a life of fulfillment as mothers. I understand not all women choose to be mothers, and maybe they can't be mothers. Maybe they're not biological mothers, but to what extent do they have influences, maybe as they're teaching younger women in the church? It balances Paul's argument in this section in verses 9 through 15 and stays on the subject. Paul also may have wanted his female readers to value the privilege of bearing and rearing children in the home, provided they walk with the Lord rather than as teachers and leaders within the church. And so just one last comment here, and that is one significant problem with this view, at least with what some people I've seen that have written, people maybe being more on the liberal side, if this is a true interpretation, then can a woman who does not bear children even find fulfillment in life? And as I mentioned, Paul may have responded that a single woman or a married woman who's not a mother can certainly find fulfillment as a woman of God. However, usually women find their greatest fulfillment as mothers. Perhaps we underestimate home influence and overestimate pulpit influences. How important is that home? I would say very important. I believe Paul was again assuming a typical situation. Most women bear children, and even though a woman may not be able to bear physical children, she may reproduce spiritual children and thus find great fulfillment. Of course, every human being, male and female, married or single, find his or her greatest fulfillment in their life through the relationship with Jesus. So just to give you a point on how important the home is, you know, we look at today's culture and the dysfunction that's going on. Children that are out of wedlock, broken homes, the crime rate, I mean, it just goes on and on. Back in the 1920s, you start to see the divorce rate. There's a very slight, steady increase. You get to the Depression in the 1930s, and it kind of evens out because of all the financial issues that are going on. Then you see an uptick right after World War II. All those war brides, you know, get married right at the time there, you're about ready to go off to war. Well, you start to see an uptick there, but it still is kind of even-paced. It's not until the mid-60s that you see a very steep incline. In 1981, the divorce rate tops out at 50%, and it slowly has kind of gradually leveled out about 46%. I think the numbers are 2015. But you're talking about the importance of the home. And I make this point not to say that, because the women have left the family and all of a sudden everything's all crazy. Sadly, at least my experience is the women that I know. Sadly, most of the time it's the men that have left the relationship. But you find there in the mid-60s, not only the uptick and the downfall of the American family, but also you start to see all the dysfunction in this culture. Edward Gibbons, who was a British member of Parliament in the late 1700s, wrote a 6-volume set on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And then one of the things he mentions there was the destruction of the family. The divorce rates in Rome really started skyrocketing. And he points that's one of the issues in terms of what was the decline in Rome. And so today, how important is the family? Certainly it's important to the church, but how important is it just to our culture, to our country? And look at all the dysfunction that we have now. And I think a lot of it does have to do with that home life. There's not the ideal home life that God had wanted to be in place. So this is certainly something that, along with certainly the foundation of the church being the cross and Christ's death, but how important it is to have that stable family, raising godly kids. So it shows you the importance of the role that women play within families. And so I think women should really take that as a compliment, is God has entrusted you with a very, very important role in terms of being there for the family. And so I think that all goes into play here in terms of that important role that the women played within the family, and also their issues in terms of, not issues, but also with what their roles were in terms of influencing other women. They had plenty on their plate to do. And so for the men, the men's role would be the ones who would be leading the church by way of, as we will find in the next chapter, in terms of elders and deacons. They'll be the ones that will be leading the worship services by way of preaching and by way of teaching. So, anyone have any comments? I do want to read for you, if there is none. I'm going to go ahead and start reading to you this article. As I said, it was in the Abilene newspaper here 3 weeks ago, and I just happened to come across this. I really wasn't looking for it, but for some reason it popped up. And the headline here, and apparently there's a church out there called the Highland Church of Christ. And the headline says, "Add Highland to the list of churches of Christ elevating women to preaching roles." And so this is not only going to talk about preaching, but they're also, some of the congregations out there also considering allowing women to be elders in the church. Something I, quite frankly, never thought that I would see, given the fact that the scriptures are so very clear in terms of the roles for women and for men in the church. Let me go ahead and read this. So it says here, Palm Sunday 2019 is a day that Karen Cook will look back on the rest of her life as a turning point. She is in her second year at Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology, where she is seeking a master's degree in divinity. Cook has 3 more semesters to go, but what she is learning during that time isn't likely to have the impact she felt in the spring. That was the day she was invited to be a guest speaker at The Refuge, a small Church of Christ congregation that meets in the Old Northwest Church of Christ on North Willis Street. I was the first woman I ever heard preach in church. She will preach again Sunday at the Mentor Lane Church of Christ, where she is a minister. Cook's voice, however, won't be that of the first female that church members have heard from the pulpit. The voice belongs to Candace Nichols, a former associate member of Mentor Lane Church of Christ, who's now a senior minister at the Brookline Church of Christ in Massachusetts. So this church has a history of allowing women to be ministers, or at least preachers. In one sense, we're all ministers, but in terms of what he's talking about here being preachers. She too remembers the weight of the moment she felt when she first got up to preach. With that precedence, it isn't surprising that an announcement made a week ago at Highland Church of Christ that women will now be allowed to preach was met with neutral response. So as another congregation says, we're going to do the same thing. It wasn't the bombshell news flash it once would have been. Church of Christ congregations are autonomous. There is no hierarchy in place, no jurisdictional conferences led by bishops such as the United Methodist and Episcopal churches, among others. Though individual congregations aren't subject to directives from ruling authorities, historically they have been united in denying women the opportunity to preach or to hold other leadership roles. Among those hearing the announcement at Highland Church of Christ last Sunday was Carolyn Dykus, a longtime member of Highland, who serves on a committee tasked with developing a process for creating a timetable for opening more roles to women at Highland. So they have their own committee. We mentioned the first week about you have these worship committees. You know, there doesn't need to be so much a worship committee. We kind of have the pattern here, don't we? And the same pattern is also set when it comes to these roles within the church. But nonetheless, I think this is one of the things you see within some of these more liberal churches is they have these other committees that are looking to make things more meaningful. And so it says here that we just threw out all kinds of suggestions. The big one was that women be allowed to preach. Though there were no audible gasp or raucous applause Sunday when the announcement was made, Dykus said people commented after the service. One member of the committee said he had heard two versions of the same comment. If they don't allow that, we're leaving. And if they do allow that, we're leaving. So it seems like there was indifference there. There was not just simply one strong indication, that, this is unscriptural. The decision to open more roles to women at Highland was a long time coming. Bill Fowler, chairman of the elders at Highland, made the announcement and read from a letter sent to the congregation September 4th. He noted Highland engaged in a lengthy congregational study and discernment process in 2000 and 2001. So this is not necessarily new. These were things that were being considered a decade or two ago. After that study, the Highland elders concluded the Scripture supported increasing roles of women in our worship. Since then, women have been allowed to read Scripture in worship services, lead prayers, and participate in other worship activities. However, women still were not allowed to preach at Highland, though the elders decided, based on findings of the study, that the Scripture supported a woman preaching in our assembly. I don't know where he found that at. He continues, the preaching minister at Highland at the time was Mike Cope, who is still a member of Highland and lives in Abilene, while also serving as the director of ministry outreach at Pepperdine University of Church of Christ School in California. In that position, Cope is director of Harbor, a Bible lectureship at the university, similar to Summit, which begins Sunday at ACU. Of course, this was about 3 weeks ago. This year's Summit includes 2 women preachers. The first woman to preach at Summit was Barbara Brown Tyler, an Episcopal priest. She was one of the main theme preachers in 2014. So this is some kind of lectureship or something by ACU, and look who they've invited, an Episcopal priest, a female Episcopal priest. So this was also my convocation, Cope wrote, but the elders determined that the church needed more time to absorb the change that were made and to study and discern further on preaching. That was in 2001. 18 years, apparently, was the time needed for the discernment, and with the announcement coming September 8th by Fowler, going forward, both men and women will be considered for guest speaking opportunities and for church positions that include preaching. The preaching minister position at Highland isn't likely to open in the near future. A new minister, Shane Hughes, came on board in August after holding the same position at the Campbell Church of Christ in San Jose, California. In an email, Hughes said he knew the elders were in a discernment process concerning women's roles when he was interviewed. That process didn't conclude until after he had been offered the position. Hughes had determined that Highland was the right place for him and his family, no matter the decision on women preachers. He was impressed with the faithful and mature ways that Highland leadership took on the important decisions. And although I am theologically aligned with the elders on this decision, Hughes said, it would not have changed our decision to serve Abilene. Hughes said in his email that he had served in churches that included women in various ways in leading worship, but not preaching. Though women now can preach at Highland, they still can't serve as elders or shepherds, as they sometimes are called. However, Fowler said in the letter he sent to the congregation that the church made a commitment in 2017 to study that issue as well. So they are now studying the issue on allowing women to serve the role of elders and deacons. To honor that commitment, the letter said, we plan to have a church-wide discernment process on that topic. Fowler said in the interview that the changes occurring at Highland have been ongoing for so long that it wasn't surprising after this announcement. He did hear a lot of positive reinforcement during the discernment process and not much negative. So it seems like pretty much the congregation was on board with this. They found no issue with it. This wasn't the case, however, in 2001 when the discernment process began. The elders got a lot of pushback then. It certainly caused reaction, he said. So just over time, you see how the attitudes have changed. He continues, but just because the doors have been opened doesn't mean there will be hordes of women lined up to take advantage of the opportunity. ACU's Graduate School of Theology often has women students from other denominations who earn degrees en route to becoming preachers. But because of the historical prohibitions, few of them come to churches of Christ or come to congregations or to universities that have that background with the Church of Christ. The dean of ACU's College of Biblical Studies said in an email he knows only of about 20 Churches of Christ congregations where women are allowed to preach. So relatively small a number, but still I'd say quite disturbing. One of those in Abilene is the Mentor Church. Alan Teal, an ACU music professor and elder at Mentor Lane, provided a copy of the letter sent to Mentor Lane members in November 2017. That letter included a quote from a 1999-2001 study. The letter noted that in 1990, the elders started a study of Scripture pertaining to women's roles. The elders at the time concluded that the Lord has granted us more freedom than our brotherhood and congregation attitudes and relationships will allow at present. So this is 20 years ago. Fast forward to November 2017 when a letter was sent to the congregation from the elders detailing the outcome of discussions and preparations. The consensus was that the eldership in the pulpit should be open to any godly, wise leader regardless of gender. Since then, 2 women have preached at Mentor, an assistant professor at ACU's College of Biblical Studies. So one of them is a woman that is in the graduate school there at ACU. On Sunday, Cook's name will be added to that list. So Teal said the discussion about women preachers actually began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and that women were gradually incorporated into worship services. Historically, Church of Christ deacons have been men, but in the mid-2000s, Mentor Lane changed the name from deacons to Ministry Coordination Team. And including in that committee or those teams were women. In 2005, the gender makeup of the team was about half and half, Teal said, and as of today, it's still the same. The church is small and changes gradual occur naturally. More things we tend to do to be as fairly organic. However, he said there have been a deliberate effort to open roles in the worship services for women. And I'm on my last page here. So in the spring of 2017, a resource person who invited to lead a one-day retreat at the church. That was followed by a small group discussion, prayer, and discernment. Then in November, the letter was sent to the congregation announcing that the eldership in the pulpit should be open to any godly, wise leader regardless of gender. The decision wasn't without controversy, and the church lost some members. We still love those folks, Teal said, and we'll miss them. And the article concludes by saying here, the women who broke ground at Mentor Lane was Nichols, whose experience propelled her to the senior preaching position at the Brookline Church of Christ in Massachusetts. Nichols came to Abilene in 2016 from Spokane, Washington to get a master's degree in ACU, but her mother got sick and she had to drop out, but then she came back in 2016, she graduated. She worked part-time in charge of communications at Mentor Lane and worked full-time for 5 years as an associate. But it goes on just to mention about how she kind of broke the grounds in terms of that. But that's what's happening today. 20 congregations, but you know, I think about that, how he says it, how it just kind of slowly grew, that it needed time to be acceptable. You know, I remember back in the 70s, that was the same thing with homosexuality and the acceptance within the culture. They're very patient about it. They kind of threw it out there on TV. They tended to have humorous characters, and it made it where it'd be less intimidating. But just like with what happened there, we see here that this is also going on here. But thank you for your attention, and next week we will start into chapter 3 on the qualifications for elders and deacons.